The two books I did today are Alan Bullock's Hitler and Stalin, and Michael Mann's Fascists. And I will begin with Hitler and Stalin. It was written by Alan Bullock, and this one is the second edition. The main argument is that it is really just a comparative analysis of Hitler and Joseph Stalin and their political lives. I shouldn't just say just. It's a very extensive book. One of the supporting arguments is that the only aspect that does get into their private lives is their origins, which is actually quite helpful to understand, to kind of gain a baseline mindset of what formed these two individuals. The supporting argument is that they actually, with their relations with their parents, are actually quite similar, even though Hitler came from a more middle class background, and Joseph Stalin was the very definition of a poor family in Georgia and the Caucasus. But both their fathers were rarely around, and when they were around, they were quite stern, would be the soft way to put it, or abusive would be the practical way to put it. But their mothers both poured their heart and souls into their children. It was quite impressive, of how, especially Stalin's mother, who they're living in rural Georgia and have little to nothing with their lives, because the father leaves when Joe's young because he was a cobbler, and his parents were recently freed peasants since the abolition of serfdom in Russia, and he left to go 40 miles away to work in a shoe factory because he was a cobbler. But 40 miles back in the late 19th century is quite an extensive travel. So their mothers raised them and kind of led into the mindset. Like with Hitler, his mother, he constantly lied to his mother, essentially, because his mother wanted him to make him into something. Hitler pretty much lied to her in his early life. He just wanted to do what he wanted to. A perfect example is how Hitler was described in his youth as idle, willful, and disrespectful, which is kind of in line with Stalin as well. But they both kind of gravitated towards charismatic, lower class heroes, like Joseph Stalin, when he was studying to be a priest in the Russian Orthodox Church. He eventually broke away and joined rebel groups, is a strong way to put it, but for Georgian, because he was early on, he would adapt. He went full Russian. He, as opposed to Hitler, who tried to bring Austria back into the grand overall German nation. Joe Stalin went full bore Russian, but because Joe Stalin's first pseudonym was Koba, which was a Georgian Robin Hood, essentially. And Hitler also loved the romanticized stories. It was especially about the Native Americans and the American West. He was really big into reading stories about that. And actually, when he was Reichs Chancellor, he would still, I believe it's Karl May's writings, that he would even then would almost recite them by heart. Like I said, they were both heroic rebels. Another sub-argument is that and a sub-argument's a strong word because it's really just a comparative analysis, putting two biographies next to each other. Kind of like I believe in the foreword he references, it's a lot like Plutarch's Parallel Lives, which is actually the subtitle of his book, Parallel Lives, because he's copying Plutarch and comparing these two infamous individuals. But another, what you would call a sub-argument, is that through the chaos of their respective political situations, Hitler and Stalin were able to manipulate and control, through their sheer force of personality, essentially, and they just climbed the ranks. The author, Alan Bullock, does an excellent job with the biographical and comparative analysis. It is impressive. With this book, if you can't find what you're looking for, I don't know what you're looking for. It's over 1,000 pages, and it's quite detailed, and it is extremely impressive work. With the methods, the author doesn't really use a pattern of analysis. Like I said, it's just two biographies side by side. The book it actually falls under quite a bit of historical categories, biographical, obviously, but also when you dig into it, since these guys were authoritarians, you have to factor in the political, social, and military aspects of their political decisions and life. Because, like I said, authoritarians, they tend to control most of their society. Distress with the political aspect is just because, like I said, the manipulation and the way they rose up through their political hierarchies is quite impressive. And anybody's taken the Russian history course, Stalin was deft at cutting in his photo next to Lenin, and it was quite savvy. And there's actually photos in the book that you kind of look at and go, that looks like a cut and copy, but that's old Joe. The military history, especially because it gets into World War II, obviously because of their lives, and also World War I, but also the interwar years with their military policies, especially with Hitler when, not revoking, but repudiating the Treaty of Versailles and secretly building up military, and Joe Stalin's 5-year plans and the increase in military technology that he stressed after in the middle of the first 5-year plan. And the social history is just because the sociological changes that occurred in Russia and Germany after the rise of the Nazis and the Bolsheviks, respectively. Especially the Bolsheviks, the fear that they generated with a socialist/communist uprising across the world can't be understated. The sources, extensive primary sources. It is extremely impressive. It goes Mein Kampf. It has Goebbels' writings. It has speeches by Joe Stalin. I was taken aback, especially looking at the bibliography. It's a who's who of who he got into this book. And what helps since this is the second edition, like I mentioned, it was published in 1993. The first one was published in 1991, which coincidentally kind of awkward timing because the Soviets just fell down. But that's why he actually did the second edition, was to gain access, because this was during when the Russian government opened up their archives, and he was able to get back in. And that's probably where you get the Joseph Stalin speeches, and he has the communist congressional transcripts, which is quite impressive. The second edition is just, I can't stress it enough, it's just impressive. But also, secondary sources used to complement, but it's to an extent, the secondary sources are almost superfluous. There's just so many hard-hitting primary documents. Even though I'm glad he used the secondary sources because it helps scholars later on, like I said, it's almost unnecessary. But it does. But there are aspects that it gives it additional perspective. I would say the strengths of the book is it's very extensive, and it deals with intricate details of each leader's lives. There are names that I ran across that I had never heard of, and granted, they are important to the story, but you learned quite a bit about these individuals. The writing style is engaging, and And also, too, it's the way the story is, the book is written. The lives are side by side, so it's kind of it'll go like he starts off with Joe Stalin's early life, and then he goes to Hitler to in the same chapter to give you a comparative of the similarities and differences between the two individuals. The maps are there are enough maps in it or there are appropriately enough maps to help you visualize certain instances and situations that he's describing, and he puts it right next to the work. So they're sparsed in throughout the book, which sometimes that can get annoying if everything's clumped in the middle. Like the publisher will put all the books, maps, and everything. It's like, well, I wish this would have been in chapter 2 when we were talking about this, as opposed to, in the middle of the book that isn't applicable. It also has an appendix of raw data, which is, oh man, it's just, this book is, I can't stop glowing about this book. Because not only with the biographical, but with this raw data, you also get perspective on the mindset and the decision making of these two men. Even though you don't really want to get into the minds too much into these guys, but it's kind of like, well, why did he shift these resources here? Oh, it was because this industry had a shortage, etc., etc. But what's really great are the pictures. Like I mentioned previously with Joe Stalin, the pictures are fantastic. Like one is that there's a photo of the men who committed the Munich putsch in 1923. And this photo is just, you can just see the self-righteousness in these men who tried to commit this act. And it kind of gives you a perspective of these men, even, convicted exile, they weren't going to stop. Like, you can just see in the photo, you can see into their eyes of just like, they think they're the founding fathers of a new nation almost. It just exudes from that photo. The photos are just fantastic. Another strength is that the author is very knowledgeable. I stress very knowledgeable. And he's written several significant books about the war, especially Hitler. The author, what also helped too is that Bullock lived during the war. So it's hard to replicate that aspect of someone who the gravitas of the story is, because we study Hitler and Stalin, but when somebody was even though they can be biased in some regards, just to get someone who saw their rise or essentially their rise and fall is just it's extremely valuable. So the weaknesses, and this is the only section where I struggled at, was the weaknesses. It does tend to jump around in the timelines. Like I said, in each chapter it'll go from Joe Stalin to Hitler. It can kind of break your flow when reading. And the amount of data, like I said, is very impressive. But on the downside, it can overwhelm you from time to time. You're taking in so much information that you almost, even though it sounds silly, it's a 1,000-page book, you may need to read it 2 or 3 times to get all the data, to get all the perspective. It's impressive. Kind of additional notes, like I stated, Alan Bullock, he's also known as Lord Bullock. He is, his work of Hitler, A Study in Tyranny, is still used by scholars today as a baseline. And that was written, I want to say, in the 50s. And the man is, and I only learned this when I started reading the book, of how influential this author is. So if you have anything, and also the book covers from 1879 to 1953. He ends up covering up to Joe Stalin's death. And as he states, even though Hitler committed suicide in 1945, his impact is still felt. I mean, till at least 1953, so that's why he didn't end in 1945. But yeah, this is, if you have anything, literally anything to do with Hitler, Stalin, heck, even the Nazis or the Bolsheviks, and this book I highly recommend this book. It's thorough, I guess would be the proper way to put it. The other book I did was Michael Mann's, like I said, Michael Mann's Fascists. And when I first picked the book, I assumed it would be more like Alan Bullock's like biographies about fascist leaders and stuff. I was pleasantly surprised because it is a book about the psychological and sociological basis for why fascism would even rise. What's the whole point? What are the origins? Like the thesis of the book is to explain fascist motivations, where they came from, who they were, and how fascism rose to power in the interwar period from World War I to World War II. Some of the supporting arguments is that and this was very intriguing to me. Fascism is a part of modernity. And I always butcher that word. Is a part of the modern world, because some people would make the argument that, fascism is is actually conservative or a liberal, or it's not of our time. But he makes an excellent argument that fascism is not only of our time. We should expect fascism more in the coming years. And he wrote this in 2004. And some would say he's quite prophetic. Another is that he stresses that fascism is not a branch off of the modern world. It's not, as he puts it, a sideshow. It grows side by side in Europe. It grows side by side with the modernization. That point is extremely fascinating. Fascism also, he stresses, must be taken seriously on 4 other fronts, with the fascist mindset, their political movements as serious actions, because usually you can be like, it's just a handful of nut jobs that are going to do that. It's like, no, these are, they may only be a handful of them, but they are representing people that, as I believe the Nixon years called it, the silent majority, but there's a silent large group that could easily jump into this, into the fascist camp. To look at the societal members that constitute the fascist movements, and that really the extreme members of fascist movements perpetrate great horrors in history. You have obviously Hitler and the Holocaust. They were, especially after the war, when you talk to fascists, there was actually a defense of, I believe one of the other prisoners stated that, it was only the certain Nazis, it wasn't the German military that committed these murders, etc., etc. It's like, no, well, the fascists are leading the military, so that would somebody's got to do it. As also too, and I think this is actually one of the more poignant points to support the thesis, is that fascism is not a footnote in history. It can easily come back. Fascism is almost like a chameleon when it comes to the political spectrum. And the author supports these arguments extremely well. It's a fascinating read. The method is, the book has a topical layout, but within each topic, it has a chronological structure, which, when history is probably, I think Dr. Wells said it best, should be the way you should do it. And it shows the origin and growth of fascism. The author uses 5 countries to analyze this: Germany, Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Romania, and the differing aspects of fascism. It's kind of like the Germans focused more on the people, the Volk, excuse me, and focused on the ethnic side of, because a big part of fascism is cleansing, whether that be political or ethnic cleansing. Well, the Germans decided, obviously, to focus on the ethnic part and the racial part. While you talk about Italy as a prime example, and I believe Romania, but and the other, Hungary and Romania, but Italy focused more on the political spectrum, because if you didn't agree with them politically, they would cut you out. But if you came back, they would let you back into the system, as opposed to the Germans, as with the Jews. There was no way that a Jew could have been like, oh yeah, I'm 100% fascist, and Nazis don't have anything to do with it. Let's see. and it in those 5 countries of why they gained popular support, and how actually fascism goes across economic spectrums. It's not just, because people make the argument, oh, it's the middle class, so they punch down to the lower classes to keep them in their place so they can aspire to be the upper classes. And he points out brilliantly, you had industrialists, you had capitalists, you had poor people, you had middle class, everyone across the spectrum could have been a fascist. And that argument is quite sticks in your mind. It falls under 4 categories: psychological, economic, sociological, and political history. Psychological, because of the mind, it delves into the mindset and the psychology of why fascism rises, what are the instigators. Usually it's an economic crisis, shown in Italy, especially during the Great Depression. That just fueled the fascist fire in Europe. Economic, because of the way fascism kind of distorts is probably the proper word for it, but distorts the labor markets and corporate operations to their own means. Fascists were, especially in Germany is a prime example of, even though they would rail against corporatists and people that didn't put the nation first, they eventually would lean to them because when Hitler seizes power, the fascists were they didn't have the technical know-how, so they had to make a compromise with the industrialists, saying, hey, we're going to do it this way, but I need you, so you're going to toe the line, even if you like it or not, but we need you. As long as you're not Jewish in the German sense. Sociological, because, like I stated, the class and the societal conditions needed to be fascism to be created and operate under. And political, for the obvious reason, is that how fascists manipulated political settings. They would, they like I said, they would, they were very, like I said, chameleon. They would, even though they're socialists, first they're actually called socialist nationalists, and eventually in Italy they flip it to National Socialism. But they were neither left or right, per se. They would look for an opening and then they would exploit it. It was Zalta Machiavellian would probably be the best way to put it. They would, because they would view the state as a single entity, which obviously in Germany's case was ethnic, but like I said, in Italy it's more political. So if you're not part of the entity, you're a foreigner, and they will deal with you as such. But if you like in Italy, if you come back, you're now Italian. You're part of the system again. So, and it's the way they would manipulate that is quite scary, actually. For the sources, the primary documents are limited, but they're impressive. I mean, like with the other work, they have it has Mein Kampf, and especially in the fascists has the my Italian's bad, Nazione Fascissimo, and this was by one of the main Italian fascists, Luigi Salvatorelli, and it gives those firsthand, even though they're select primary sources, they're very insightful. The author does rely on secondary sources, partially because of the psychological aspect, the stress in the book. And he uses them to compare, contrast, and the flaws to make his logical argument. It's the logic that he brings to the table is very hard to repudiate. It's a very impressive book. At the secondary sources range from dissertations to books that are from multiple languages and from different countries. Like I said, Italian, but Hungarian and the like. And it kind of gives you, as opposed to traditionally, you get Nazis Germany as, oh, this is fascism, and maybe Italy from time to time. But he uses all these countries, these five European countries, as a way to show European fascism. Because he also mentioned South America has a aspect of quasi-fascism, but he doesn't really focus on that. The strengths, the writing style of the book is easy to digest. There are a great amount of charts and raw statistical data, which he uses to support his arguments quite well. The presentation of the arguments gives you a great understanding of the movement of fascism and the government and the government functionality of it all. But what I really liked is that he doesn't really focus on Hitler and Mussolini. He focuses on the movements themselves, which is kind of refreshing, because especially after you get done reading Hitler and Stalin, like, you kind of want to take a step back and realize, well, because these men didn't create authoritarian regimes or fascist regimes, they just used them. They adopted and used them. So to get a whole view of the movement as a whole, redundant, is very insightful. The sociological analysis is intriguing, and that's actually what gripped me the most, was that it helps you visualize the people and the conditions that would be drawn to fascism. Kind of like, the 80-year-old grandmother is like, oh, I'm a fascist. Like, why would you be a fascist? Well, this book will help you explain why she would get involved. Some of the weaknesses. The jargon used relies on economic and psychological, and and even some philosophical, because he brings up Nietzsche a bit. So if you're not familiar with that, it can kind of be daunting when you got to go back and forth, like look up these terms. But if you have at least some basis in these subjects, you can overcome it, but it is a weakness of it. So the author can sometimes rely on those secondary sources from time to time a little too much, but you can, like I said, you can overcome that too. Partial by going to that secondary source, but sometimes he focuses on those other sources and critiques them from time to time, and it's like, I wish you kind of like pull back to your work here. Also, the author makes references to other books within the multi-volume work that this consists of, because he'd reference, like I said, the South American fascists, and he said, oh, that'll be in the next book in the series. And it kind of irritates me on a personal level. It's just, you either why bring it up unless you're going to dive into it? Unless you're just trying, I don't blame him for trying to sell books, but it kind of like, well, at least do a glossary overlook of the point you're making. And sometimes he'll do that, but sometimes you're like, oh, this will be in the chapter of the third book. And it's like, all right, well, I wish you would have mentioned it. Like I said, this can be irritating. But I highly recommend both books. If you're doing, of course, what books haven't been highly recommended, because they're all very good. But like I said, Hitler and Stalin, I can't stress enough. This is the place to be. And fascism is, I would read this in my spare time. It's a very intriguing book. And like I said, it bucks the trend of just focusing on single individuals and looks at the movement as itself. I hope you found this helpful, and I wish you all a good day and happy health.